right, so final sort of big plenary talk of today. After this, we'll have the poster sessions and lightning talks, so shorter talks, more action, so to get you all excited, keep you all excited. Our speaker today is Mike Thicke. He's a philosopher of science, social epistemologist, and web developer, affiliated with the Mesh Research Lab, or Mesh Research, not lab, right? It's Mesh Research Group. All right, yeah. Which is a digital humanities lab at Michigan State University. The reason we invited him for this conference was actually a paper of his that's been published, or maybe forthcoming, in the Journal for General Philosophy of Science, called Evaluating Formal Models of Science, in which you were quite critical of some of the formal work on sort of modeling scientific knowledge production. I don't know if you're going to talk about that at all today.
Not so much, actually.
Not so much, that's fine.
We should have a conversation.
We'll just read the paper for ourselves. We love that paper. Anyway, so the topic for today is models of collective knowledge production in science, and sort of this is just a fortuitous event, but I think it's sort of a perfect match with the previous talk, judging by the abstract. So yeah, we're excited to have you here, and the floor is yours, Mike.
Thank you. And first I want to echo something that Hannah said earlier, and just thanking the organizers for this conference. It's been such a great, invigorating experience, and seeing so many connections between people in different fields. And I think hopefully you'll see a lot of connections between what I'm talking about here and what previous speakers have talked about. In some sense, this talk is like where Daniel sort of wisely pulled back and said, okay, I'm not going to go further. I'm going to recklessly charge ahead and just propose a whole bunch of things with very little justification that I couldn't possibly defend. So hopefully it's entertaining if nothing else. So let's get this going. So before I start talking, oh no.
No, it's because
No. Okay, that's fine. Why didn't? Maybe it's because it's not actually. I think it's maybe. Oh, there we go. Okay, I think I just had like the wrong application, kind of like in the front. So Zoom is just right there. Okay, so before I plunge into my own argument, I kind of wanted to get a sense of the room. And this is a question I asked some people yesterday evening, but also I kind of want to see where do I stand here? How easy is my task? So I want to do a little survey. And I want you to pick one of two possible reactions to the replication crisis. One is that the methodological problems have been revealed by the replication crisis that we've been alerted to coming out of this are restricted to a few scientific domains and maybe aren't such a big deal, or they've revealed major issues that span many areas of scientific research and justifiably undermine public confidence in science as a whole. So on the one hand, maybe it's no big deal. On the other hand, maybe science is a hot mess, and we're just coming to realize this problem. And so I'm curious if you could raise your hand if you feel like you're more in the NBD camp now. Okay, a few people are a little bit more towards the NBD camp, and who are more towards the hot mess camp. Okay. We've got one person I deliberately didn't have a middle road because I figured as responsible academics, you all pick the middle one. But you're not all in my direction. Okay, so as a little bit of a preface, I want to talk about the work of John Desmond Burnell, who was a physicist and kind of a proto-sociologist of science, operating in the early 20th century. So he wrote this book, The Social Function of Science, in 1939, where he argued that scientific research should be explicitly directed towards serving the needs of society. And he also argued that uncoordinated science, this sort of chaotic science that he was observing at the time, caused waste. And so I think right here, like the problems that Bernal identified are remarkably similar to the ones that Daniel was just talking about. And he proposed to solve this a system of academies, research centers, and laboratories, and kind of this hierarchical structure, and separating much of scientific research from the traditional university context and putting it into this other system. Part of his proposal was taken up by the University Grants Committee in 1945, but it ultimately didn't really come to much. Arguing against Bernal was this guy, Michael Polanyi, who's probably more familiar to many of us as a kind of philosopher of science. So in the Republic of Science, this political and economic theory, which is probably his best known work in this area, he argued that any attempt to centrally control or plan research is going to backfire, or to direct it towards social ends. Instead, if universities hire the most eminent candidate, resources will be directed to neglected areas of science spontaneously. So he's really defending the status quo organization of science against Bernal's attempt at reform or the revolution. So ultimately, Polanyi prevailed, and the model that he was proposing is the dominant way that we understand the organization of science today. But maybe Bernal was right to some extent. I mean, in the details, if you read Bernal today, it seems very naive and so on. So I think we wouldn't follow him all the way. But maybe in broad strokes, Bernal was really onto something. And this is meant to be a kind of invitation to dream. What if Bernal had prevailed and his system of this hierarchical system had been implemented in the UK in the 1930s? What would science be like today? How would it be different? And I think it also alerts us to the fact that some of these features of science that we consider like intrinsic or inevitable in science are actually kind of historically contingent and maybe could be otherwise. And given that perspective, maybe it's worth thinking about changing them. Okay, so Polanyi's model, I'm going to call entrepreneurial science. So this model of spontaneous organization, academic freedom, scientists choosing their research topics based on personal interest, that's the dominant model of how, in social epistemology, for example, we understand how science operates. So scientists act kind of like entrepreneurs in some kind of symbolic economy. So this model is more dominant, I think, as a model of scientific activity than as a reflection of reality. There are many scientists that are employed by industry and government doing basic research. And so social epistemologists have largely assumed Polanyi's model of science, and therefore the interventions that social epistemologists often propose are within this paradigm of entrepreneurial science, and so it ends up being like tinkering with incentives within this individualistic model. And I think that's maybe a problem, and maybe the replication crisis represents an opportunity to break out of that model and think more creatively and think bigger about possible actions. So maybe it's time for more ambitious results. So a little bit more historical reflection here. What I'm calling sort of like cycles of disenchantment within philosophy of science. So the first cycle I call demythologizing science. I'm kind of borrowing this from Philip Kitcher, where it dates the beginning at 1962 with the publication of Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Also playing into this are kind of the sociology of scientific knowledge, that sort of literature, this sort of realization that scientists aren't actually exceptional. Previous to this, a lot of the trust that was imputed to science was based on some special moral character of scientists. So Stephen Shapin, for example, talks about like gentlemanly virtues that scientists were supposed to have, and this grounds our trust in science. As we see, cases like Watson and Crick acting maybe not so good in pursuing the structure of DNA, and we have this disenchantment with scientists as particularly moral people, there had to be some response to come up with some other reason why we ought to trust the results of science. I think the sort of end state of that within philosophy of science is some kind of marketplace of ideas account, where we say it isn't the individual character of scientists that is responsible for the trustworthy nature of science, but rather competition within a marketplace of ideas, something about the institutional structure of science. So work on consensus from people like Helen Longino kind of goes into this. And this continues to the present day. So if you read like Naomi Oreskes' recent work, like her book, Why Trust Science, it's very based on this model of like there's an institutional structure of science based on consensus and peer review and tenure and so on that should ground our trust in science. So it's very much philosophy of science defending a status quo. In the period of like 2000s to 2015, I see a second period in philosophy of science where philosophers are reacting to the commercialization or commodification of scientific research. This largely comes out of kind of like an SDS context, an economics of science context, but many philosophers of science also took up this idea and talked about the commercialization, the commodification of science and the problems with that. So James Robert Brown talking about clinical trials, Savino Leonelli talking about scientific commodities, Hans Ratter, several others, David Resnick about the corruption of money in science. And the response from that is that somehow science ought to be insulated from industry. So the problem is that there's this corrupting influence of money onto a system that is more or less good. And so if we remove the corrupting influence of money, then science would operate as intended. So again, it's defending a kind of status quo view of science, but this time against some sort of external aberration. And then I think it's interesting that this literature identifies many of the same problems that the replication crisis literature is identifying: publication bias, like salami science, slicing up science into least publishable units, self-citation, all sorts of bad citation practices. A lot of the stuff that people are talking about in this period, it's exactly the same stuff they're talking about in the replication crisis, but there's a much different diagnosis for why it's going on. And then we get to replication crisis, so 2015 to the present. I think there's this, in my view, this realization there's a really like perverse incentives that pervade science. And it's not some extrinsic force that's corrupting a basically well-functioning science, but actually like intrinsic problems that have existed within science for a long time and continue to exist aren't due to some corruption of an otherwise sound science, but are actually like fundamental problems with how science operates. I think it's a big question mark here about what is going to be the response to the replication crisis and the problems it's revealed from philosophy of science. Will there continue to be a defense of status quo, or are philosophers of science going to take this opportunity to look at really more substantial reforms? So when thinking about the replication crisis, I think it's maybe useful to divide the problems that we see into sort of more narrow problems and more wide problems. So some of the narrow problems include like sloppy data collection and analysis, deceptive practices such as p-hacking, publication bias, all sorts of bad publication practices, opaque research practice. By what I mean, when you read some study, the methods section, whatever, really doesn't tell you actually like how it operated, and so you can't even begin to try to replicate a study because you can't extract from the paper itself what they did. Also, like data sharing and lack of data sharing and all this kind of stuff goes into that. And then like unreliable peer review, which I'm not sure whether I should have put. I'm not sure whether I should have put unreliable peer review on the narrow or the wide thing, but this sense that peer review seems to be very bad at catching problems with research. On the wide angle, the idea of the wide stuff is that these are like bigger picture problems that we might think are causal in some sense of the narrow problems. You know, so we know that replication crisis is revealing problems that have existed within science for a long time. It's just that we're kind of noticing them more now, or becoming more alert to them. I think we might also say, though, that it's becoming more acute as scientists face increasing career pressure. So the harder it is to get a job, the harder it is to progress in your career, the more likely it is that you're going to get pushed towards some of these questionable research practices and so on, like a desperation to progress in your career or something like that. There's this wide problem of cumulative advantage, where early success leads to later success, or allows you to have later success. And I'm particularly thinking here in this problem where maybe you get early success by doing research that is spectacular or noticed, but maybe not so good from a quality perspective, and then you bootstrap from that early recognition into further resources, do more research, and so on and so forth. So maybe cumulative advantage favors bad research. I think a wide problem that a lot of people talked about is the competitive grant system. That we're very bad at allocating research funds in a sort of way that correlates to quality and all sorts of other problems. I think the general competition for prestige is a wide problem in science. That prestige is both this instrumental thing that we need in order to have a career, but also something that we pursue intrinsically. We want to be famous. And I think the pursuit of that prestige leads to a lot of problems with the type of research that succeeds and the type of research that's done. We want to do research that's going to be flashy and impressive and so on. And then these last two, I think the causal story between the wide and the narrow is a little bit fuzzier, but I think are wide problems in science that we're thinking about. So one is the connection between results and conclusions. So even if your study replicates, you know, it isn't, from that perspective, it's okay. A lot of times there's some funny business that goes on from the sort of narrow results of your study to the implications, the wide implications for what significance that study actually has. And so thinking like, you know, sometimes there's results in studies are hyped, overhyped, and interpreted in ways that we might not think are justified. And then finally, I think there's a wide problem of relevance. Is the research that's getting done socially relevant, relevant for developing the field? Are we building a wall, or are we merely you know, building bricks that go into the brickyard? So I think that's a wide problem. Okay. So when we start diagnosing the wide problems, I think I give some kind of argument like this: individualistic competition, exacerbated by increasing career pressures, lead to poor research practices, harming both the epistemic progress of science, so kind of like the objective progress of science, and the reputation of science, how sort of consumers of scientific knowledge view science. And if we sort of look back from this to the first discussion that I had about coming out of Kuhn and SSK, does it matter that scientists are just like normal people and aren't particularly morally virtuous? I think, yeah, it actually kind of does matter. And the response that philosophers of science gave to these problems that arise doesn't actually seem like such a great response. And we might want to rethink that initial response of philosophy of science to the problems that Kuhn and sociologists raised doesn't seem correct. Okay. I also want to mention we're thinking about how we solve these narrow problems. This thing, Goodhart's law, which has many different formulations, and James mentioned this in the discussion yesterday. So this is coming from this paper, which is ultimately about like monetary policy, but it's been much more widely construed. Cashed out this idea that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Many other formulations of this. And so we have obvious examples of this within science, like the H-index. So once we try to measure how much scientists are producing impactful research by seeing, how many of their papers are cited how many times, well, all sorts of bad things start to happen with self-citation practices and like demanding that people cite you if they're going to be published in your journal, and all of this like really bad stuff. So, in retrospect, we just wish the H-index didn't exist because it's probably caused more problems than it's solved. Journal impact factors, journals, requiring that you cite work in their own journal in order to be published in the journal, and all sorts of crazy stuff that happens there. So a lot of times these narrow solutions that we try to make end up having no effect, or in fact backfiring. I think this is also similar to stuff that Aidan was talking about yesterday, in which some of these narrow interventions in scientific practice can have not the effects that we intended. So it's kind of meant to motivate the idea that trying to solve these narrow problems while the wide problems remain is just going to create new narrow problems. We really have to address the wider problems if we want to solve some of the big issues that we see in our. Okay. So I think at this point, I just want to have a little aside talking about the work that I do today. So I'm the technical lead on a website called Humanities Commons, which is part of MES Research. MES Research also includes the Public Philosophy Journal and something called the Collaborative Community Review Project. This is an application that we're developing to facilitate a collaborative review process. So it's a pre-publication peer review, but done in a much more constructive way, where peer reviewers end up being collaborators whose main goal is to not serve as gatekeepers, but as a part of a team that improves the quality of a paper. So that's a project that we're working on. We also have a project called Humetrics HSS, which seeks to create more humane metrics of success in research, and they have various procedures for doing that. The CCR project is using these humane metrics as a way of guiding reviewers through the review process and giving them axes against which to review papers. So looking specifically at Humanities Commons, which I'm most involved with, It's an academic social network. It exists. You can go to it. It includes a document repository. I would say that both the social network and the repository at this point are showing their age. They've been out there for a long time. There's quite a few problems with them. MSU, where I'm at, inherited these from the Modern Language Association. And so over the last couple of years, we've been trying to kind of reboot and improve these. And so that's sort of where I came into the project. We're trying to expand beyond the humanities. So we haven't quite figured out how we're rebranding, but internally we're talking about it as the Commons rather than Humanities Commons, and thinking about how we rebrand ourselves to be not focused on the humanities. And moving away from like having everything occur on one website to more of a decentralized network of networks type of social network that includes networks from many different institutions and things like that. Building tools for academics to collaborate on, share, and discuss research. And we're also developing a next generation repository focused on open research. And that's specifically funded by the National Science Foundation. We got a nice grant from that very recently. And we're in partnership with CORE, the Coalition for Open Access Repositories, who also got a large amount of funding recently from the Arcadia Foundation. And if all goes well, we might get some of that money too. So we're working on building this next generation repository, improving our social network, expanding our disciplinary focus beyond. All this is to say, I'm advocating some very radical changes to how scientific works. And I'm arguing that narrow changes maybe aren't so effective, but in my actual job, I'm kind of doing small changes. So, you know. Okay, so I wanted to talk about 3 approaches to solving wide problems that have been revealed by the replication crisis. One approach is greatly expanding the role of prediction markets in science. Another is some kind of socialized science model based on this stuff I talked about from Bernal. And the third is some kind of socialized assessment that's inspired by the IPCC's assessment reports. And I think you can think about these as kind of really scaled up versions of consensus conferences that are much more ambitious, but have similar instincts. Okay, so first, prediction markets. So the argument for prediction markets goes something like this. The market for science is broken in various ways. Rather than abandon the market mechanism, let's lean into it. So you see this argument from sort of free market fundamentalists a lot. The solution to market failures is to expand markets. Everything for a free market fundamentalist is solved by more markets. So, for example, pollution is a problem of externalities. Pollution is a social cost resulting from individual corporations maximizing their profits. So the solution is to kind of endogenize this externality and have some sort of market for pollution. And by expanding the markets, maybe we can solve this apparent market failure. Okay, so maybe that something like this works in science too. Maybe we can address the market failures within science by expanding markets. A little brief thing on how prediction markets work, although I think in this room, pretty much everybody knows. So you might have a contract that asks a question like, will X replicate? I sell it to you for $1. And in that is a chit or something. I'll give you 50 cents if it does and 50 cents if it doesn't. And then you can go ahead in your market and sell these different chits. And as the market prices these tickets differently, the idea is that the price of these will reflect the probability that the thing is true. So if the yes contract on replication costs 35 cents, then we can kind of interpret this as a 35% probability that it will replicate. There's a whole bunch of details I'm getting past, but that's the basic idea. So prediction markets have been used a few times, looking at the replication specifically. Yeah, so they've been quite successful, although notably, like not really much more successful than surveys, but nevertheless, they've been successful. Prediction markets have also been successful in other domains like predicting the results of elections, sporting events, things like that. They're used internally by companies like Google. Prediction markets for scientific predictions like climate indicators, global average surface temperature or something like that, exists on a very, very small scale. Proposals to greatly expand the role of prediction markets. So I'm thinking of the work of like Robin Hanson, who's a strong proponent of prediction markets. Shilin Xu has proposed markets specifically for climate science. The idea here is you have subsidized prediction markets with, you have to qualify in some way to be entered in them. That's an interesting bill. The funder, say a granting organization, creates a market where the sale price of contracts is below the resolution price. So essentially, just by buying into the market, you're making money. And then by succeeding in the market, you're making even more money. What questions get asked are sort of determined by the granting organizations, and that can be more or less democratic. And then to fund research, scientists can appeal to investors, and that can then lead to profits on the prediction markets. So you might say, okay, if you fund my research project, I'm going to succeed on this prediction market, I'm going to make us a ton of money, and so you can actually realize a monetary return by funding my research. And maybe we have a better, more reliable way of funding research projects that way. And then as you succeed in prediction markets and you make money, then that success can be rolled into doing future research projects, okay? So that's the proposal. The resolution of the markets, what the prices are here, kind of replaces journal publication as the dominant means of communicating the results of scientific research. So we're not trying to interpret papers anymore, we're just looking at market prices, and that's telling us the answer or the probable answer to the questions that we care about. So how does this address these various problems? So in terms of increasing curve pressure and cumulative advantage, prediction markets have a fairly low barrier to entry. You can start sort of arbitraging and making money on these markets without a great amount of investment. So you can get in and kind of bootstrap that maybe modest success to greater and greater success if you're good at this sort of thing. So problems with the competitive grant system, well, the funding is now retrospective. You get money by succeeding rather than telling someone a story about how you're going to succeed. Competition for prestige is replaced by competition for profit. The market predictions are transparent. So this problem of hype maybe doesn't so much exist. And relevance is really determined by the agencies setting these questions. So scientists aren't choosing themselves what to look at, but instead are doing research as real entrepreneurs to try to make money solving questions that other people are asking. Okay. Many problems here. One is that predictions must be adjudicable or resolvable, right? So we have to ask questions that are somehow answerable within a specific time period, and we can say who was correct and who wasn't, and so on and so forth. So that's a problem. So I think one worry here is it distorts science away from significant questions toward adjudicable ones. So we start answering the questions that we're able to answer maybe rather than the ones that we actually care about. This probably harms informal scientific communication because all of a sudden your former collaborators and colleagues and peers are your competitors in a market. And so you don't want to share your results or research or early ideas with them. It favors short-term questions, partly because you just have to resolve the market in order to pay people their money, and partly because prediction markets get less and less reliable as the time horizon goes out. Yeah, so many problems with prediction markets that we need to think about. Option number 2, socializing science. So the proposal here is that we redirect government funding for scientific research away from traditional academic, university-bound context to dedicated research institutes. So Bernal's proposal, essentially. So we would do this gradually for an increasing number of domains. We start lowering the amount of money that's going from granting agencies to traditional university-bound researchers, and use that money to create these research institutes and fund research by dedicated researchers that have a much different looking career than a traditional academic. So scientists employed research institutes have this more stable career position, not particularly tied to the outcomes of the research, but rather the quality of it. And the agenda of the institutes is set with some sort of democratic input toward socially pressing problems. So there's this sort of democratic oversight or something like that that can ask important questions that scientists then go and answer. So there's many examples, this is all in the United States, of existing government research institutes, Ames Laboratory, Brookhaven National Laboratory, Jet Propulsion Laboratory. In the US, these are pretty much like defense research, high energy physics, astronomy, so some like capital intensive, like physics kind of research, some health kind of stuff, a lot of defense kind of research. But we could imagine expanding from this model outward. It's not something that doesn't exist already, it's something that might be expanded. If we look at performers of basic research in the United States today, and this is by amount of funding, there's about a 4-to-1 ratio between funding for basic research in higher education and funding for research done by government. Now, this is funding, and because this research is the type of research that's quite expensive, the ratio of like people is going to be much higher here. But still, it's actually like fairly significant, the amount of basic research that's getting done in sort of government institutions in the United States already. If we look at sources of funding for basic research, the federal government is the biggest funder of basic research in the United States, accounting for about 45% of funding for scientific research. Other sources of funding from academic institutions, nonprofits, business, and so on are much lower, but still significant. So even if you reduce the amount from the federal government to zero, there is still some funding if you really, really, really want to be somebody who still works in the traditional university context. So research probably wouldn't come to a complete halt in universities, but as we reduce this, you'd expect less and less of the sort of action of research to be in the university and more to be. How do we address problems? So tenure is no longer an issue. Advancement isn't tied to the results of a particular study. Having one sort of home run study early in your career isn't so crucial. Issues of cumulative advantage in the competitive grant system. We're now looking at stable, non-grant based funding for research. So these problems seem less important. You know, as far as competition for prestige, it really depends on how you organize this stuff. Currently, if you're a government employee, one of these institutes, you're often still publishing in sort of like the regular outlets, although there's more, you know, strictures about open publication, you know, open science kind of stuff. But still, you might be like a fairly traditional academic researcher. But we could imagine getting away from journal publication in this system. There's no real financial or career incentive to overhype your results and so on. And the research institutes are sort of explicitly given socially relevant problems to address. So maybe that addresses this relevance issue. So there's some obvious potential problems here. So maybe it just kills scientific innovation and creativity. I think this is like one of Paul Enny's major concerns, and we might think is more or less true, but something worth thinking about at the very least. If you have this stable career as a research scientist inside one of these institutes, like what incentives are there to produce good research or do any research at all? Are we going to get a bunch of people that are sort of just like coasting 5 minutes? Yeah. Do all the good scientists stay in traditional academic positions and compete for that reduced research funding, while kind of the second-rate ones go? This is a concern that Hannah raised last night. Well, the traditional academic, the bad ones sort of go into government. And then maybe there's this like concern about politicization of science. If the politicians are setting the research agenda, well, maybe we're kind of worried about that. And there's something about the autonomy of science that we're really concerned about damaging with this system. So there's problems there. Okay, last one, socialized assessment. So, proposal here, publicly fund assessment reports for socially important areas of research. Assessment reports synthesize, evaluate, and generate policy recommendations based on existing research. So, something that's pointing us that this might work out is that replication markets and survey results show that assessment is possible even when there's a high frequency of questionable research practices. So these assessment reports can serve as sort of a filter, and a synthesizer, and an evaluator, even if the underlying research in the field is like kind of a hot mess. The current research practice remains largely intact. There's this extra layer between the people doing the research and the consumers of that research that seeks to interpret and evaluate and so on what's going on. So an example of this, the inspiration for this is IPCC, founded in 1988, first assessment report in 1990, the sixth one is in progress, funded mainly by governments. The United States by far is the biggest funder of that. The assessment process, I think, is like very admirable if you look at how the IPCC assessment reports work. I won't talk through all of it, but it's really interesting from kind of like a social epistemology or an epistemological perspective. It doesn't do original research. It's explicitly designed to be credible and accessible. There's very interesting calibrated language around expressing uncertainty. Government is involved, so we have government review down here, for example, but in like this limited, constrained way that really doesn't seem to harm the final product, as you might think that it would. The IPCC, although it doesn't do original research, does seem to serve as kind of an agenda setter for climate-related research. So Michaela Sundberg makes this argument that the IPCC kind of mediates between science and policy. And one researcher says that it functions as like a communication surface between the ones who do research and the ones who have money, such as politicians and funding agencies. So it actually is affecting the underlying research, even though it's not doing so directly. And I think that's encouraging for this proposal. Okay, so I'm pretty close to the end here. How socialized assessment addresses wide problems. On these like first ones, it like kind of doesn't, or at least not directly. All of these things still exist. All the existing structures are still in place, but maybe it doesn't matter as much that there's all these problems remaining, and we can try to sort this out separately while the assessment reports kind of filter out and give us a better sense of what's going on. So assessment reports filter out how you can produce this credible synthesis of research is kind of the hope. And the assessment reports hopefully push researchers and funders toward relevance. If appealing to these assessment reports is kind of like an obligatory thing for you to receive grant funding, then it can have this agenda setting feature. Okay, problems here. Doesn't really address any of the problems fundamentally. Instead, it tries to like ameliorate them. The IPC's process might not generalize so well, and we might have to think about exactly how you would do that in other domains. It might be the fact that like the assessment reports work so well because the research that it's assessing isn't so problematic to begin with, and so there isn't such a problem that it's trying to solve. It might be harder in other areas. And then also, like, can you generate sufficient interest from governments to actually set up all of the things that are required to do these assessment reports? So last slide. What do we do? What do we do about addressing application crisis? Fundamental changes to organization of science are risky. You look at any of these proposals, it's like, oh, I don't know. Assessment reports seem the safest. Prediction markets and socialized science are like obvious big risks. There's bound to be many unintended consequences, probably all three. But the more you think there are major intractable problems in science, the more willing you should be to accept the risks. I wrote a paper on prediction markets a few years ago, saying like one of the main arguments was prediction markets, if you expand them greatly, are going to have all of these unintended consequences for the performance of scientific research. We don't want to risk those unintended consequences. Don't do this. Now I think, hey, maybe it's worth a try. Like, what are we really losing here? You know, I think it's also on a meta level, it's risky to make big proposals as an academic. It's easy to criticize proposals like this, hard to defend them. I think the way that we operate kind of pushes people away from proposing the sorts of things that I'm proposing. And maybe we want to think about what is it in our field that we need to do in order to have big discussions about how scientific research. And that is all.
Yeah, thanks so much for this, Mike. This is great. Big proposals, so you know, go ahead, shoot. Nobody knows.
It's a question for clarification, actually.
Sure.
So especially on the second proposal, this question came up and it made me think, could you speak a little bit to how you understand competition? Because it seems to have both a negative and a...
That was my stop mic alarm.
It seems to have both, you seem to have both a negative and a sort of more positive understanding of what competition is or does in science and to scientists. So could you speak a little bit to how you understand this? Because it was both addressed as a
right, so
wide
not
problem and as a thing to say sort of socialization is probably not a very good solution.
So the initial question was like, what do I mean by competition? And I think like there's at least two senses of competition that I'm kind of getting at. And one is like a direct competition for resources. So competition for grants, say. And then another is sort of a more hazy competition for recognition. And it's that competition for recognition that a lot of social epistemologists have pointed to as sort of like an organizing feature of scientific research. By doing things that are going to get noticed or be useful to other scientists or other researchers, I'm going to succeed myself. So it's kind of like invisible hand explanation of science that is often given. And so that's the kind of competition I mean there. So I'm not totally sure if I got like at your question, but that's something.
Sorry, I was trying to fix the screen.
Oh yeah, sure.
Thank you very much for a very provocative talk. I think that's exactly the right thing at this point in the afternoon to get us. I have a question about your proposal of more or less drawing research out of the universities. I mean, the universities serve both research and education.
Yes.
And there's a long tradition, Humboldt, the American Graduate School, et cetera, that claims that it's a close integration between research and education that is important for higher education. So how do you see your proposal from the perspective of universities and their role for higher education?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. So I mean, one thing is I might want to push back at the claim, actually, that in order to be a good teacher, you need to be a good researcher. That's sort of been an assumption that has sort of informed the university system for a long time. I'm a little skeptical that that's true. And we've also seen more recently that just in practice, there's many, many more people who are just teachers in the university context. We're thinking about like adjunct contract faculty, teaching stream faculty there. I'm not sure there's evidence that like teaching quality has declined. It declines when someone has to teach 4 courses a term and has no time and isn't paid well and so on. But does it decline because they aren't doing active researchers? I'm not sure about that.
Vincent, I think.
Yeah. No, I was just wondering. So the last proposal I make about the socialized seems to be a bit similar to what Daniel proposed, also with the consensus conference type of thing. I mean, how do you see this work? Similar to what was argued there by Daniel, or do you see it working?
So I think it's similar idea, but quite different in practice. So the consensus conference seems much more sort of limited in scope, and the ones Daniel was talking about were about like establishing methodologies and so forth, less so about establishing consensus about like what we believe as rheumatologists or whatever. And so like these assessment reports, I think you can think of them doing sort of like both sort of setting common standards for research and the kind of stuff that's being done in consensus conferences, and doing synthesis and assessment of existing research and saying like, what can you conclude from this body of work about the questions that we're interested in? And then I imagine also like a much more expansive, like big process of producing, detailed reports aimed at different audiences and so on and so forth.
So then these assessments would indeed feed into, let's say, future funding, for instance, for researchers.
Yeah, and it really depends, on funders. In the climate science case, it turns out that it's more and more important to be able to appeal to these assessment reports in order to get funding for research. And we can imagine something similar to that happening in other areas of science, where just sort of like naturally these things become sort of like the agenda setters, or we can force them to be, depending on how we want to do it.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. Many interesting ideas. I'm still trying to make sense of the second idea, socializing science, in terms of what really the key drivers of the proposed impact are, because I see. So how is this going to change science?
Okay.
And kind of what might be less invasive ways of getting to the same stage? Because it sounds to me like the important thing is greater contract security. I mean, that we could do in universities, that people don't need to hire. Maybe more localized assessment of research, so that the institute guarantees some of the quality. Right. So I was wondering what we could do without taking it out of universities and kind of disrupting all the structures.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So I think a big part of this is like, how do we change what the career path of a scientist looks like, and what it requires to succeed in your career, and what vision of yourself you have as a researcher. And you could think of that as changing how that works without making the huge change that I'm thinking of. There's also the sort of coordination and collaboration aspect that might be harder to achieve without bigger structural changes. So if we think working together and collaborating as a group is something that's very important, then it becomes more interesting to put people in a building together. So
Daniel?
Yeah, thanks for a very nice talk. The contract thing, by the way, the Netherlands has a new labor agreement that you get a fixed or permanent contract after 2 years in academia. So that's trying to do it. So you can try. My department used to be a public-private collaboration. I think the first in the Netherlands between Philips, electronics company, and they were an institute for perception research. It worked remarkably well. First of all, I would say don't take the money from government, but take it from companies. No, I mean, that's actually, we don't do it. I don't know why, because we give them a lot of stuff back for it. And but it was ridiculously productive. And Philips stopped it at a certain moment, but they generated huge amounts of knowledge, but also very, because the worry is they will dictate what will happen, but they had a lot of freedom. They did these reports. Recently, a colleague retired who created a compression algorithm which your phone uses to communicate human voices as efficiently as possible over the phone. All these kind of things happen. So it's very rare, but they produce very useful knowledge. So I think it works very much, but for the teaching thing, I also agree. So I would take the money from companies, just have more scientists, and yeah, it's not a crazy idea to get money from companies. They don't pay for our science, but they get a lot from it. So.
Yeah, I think there's research from STS like showing that like business like research, like private research is actually often like very high quality. We might worry about like the agenda setting kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
you have to give them freedom, so reasonable freedom.
I think it's a lot for the interesting talk. I have a question actually regarding the prediction market idea. If I understood correctly, it's like stock exchange like medium would put the entrepreneurship of the scientists to the highest priority, right? But you also mentioned that previously, like around 2000 to 2015 time span of scientific advancement, this increase in entrepreneurship was perceived to be something negative and it was criticized for the scientists. So my question is, what would you suggest as measures in these predictions markets such that like the scientific quality of the work, like that incentive aligns with that entrepreneurship aspect of this stock exchange?
Yeah, so in the like worries about the commercialization of science, you know, many of the worries weren't so much about research quality, but decreases in like communication, generating patents, things like that, but also sort of, you know, doing some bad research to justify like, you know, drug companies producing pharmaceuticals and stuff like that. The prediction markets, like as I said, like the idea of these prediction markets is that we're going to let scientists be entrepreneurs like the whole way. So now it's like a problem when you're supposed to be operating in a symbolic economy, and then a company comes to you with like a whole dump truck full of cash. And now your incentives from the symbolic economy are competing with a lot of money, and the money wins. And so the incentives in the symbolic economy get overwhelmed by the incentives in the real economy. The idea of prediction markets is just to take everything into the real economy, forget about the symbolic economy, and the best way to get rich as a scientist is to do well in these very well-funded prediction markets. That's kind of the idea.
Double down.
Yeah.
James.
So I was trying to figure out how to think about these prediction markets with respect to at least, you know, the findings that that I and others have that basically surprise almost universally drives future attention in science. So this, I mean, this would suggest that basically our predictions, like the modal prediction, is going to have massively diminishing marginal returns, right, to the field as a whole. So I'm just trying to understand, like I was thinking, and maybe I'm wrong here, I was thinking that you were using the prediction markets to actually identify violations, basically, like more clearly to drive transients of attention in the field. But it seems like you're doing the opposite. So I'm just trying to figure out why and what value? I mean, you know, so people are not doing research. They're spending a lot of time doing post-publication evaluation of existing paper value, and you know, anyway, or is it, yeah, I'm just trying to.
Okay,
I can imagine a lot of ways to use them, but not
Yeah,
the way you're saying.
yeah.
To
Let
use
me clarify sort of what I mean, and then see if that if it still
Okay.
if it affects what you're thinking about. So when we're talking about like prediction markets for replication, we're evaluating, you know, will this thing replicate, right? So then we're like looking at evaluating existing research. It's sort of like a second order prediction market.
And then when you use that, okay, so we've distributed funds, we have a stock in this, what? So
But
then,
instead, the kind of thing I'm proposing is you're asking direct questions about the world, right? So will global average surface temperatures rise by more or less than 4 degrees centigrade by 2035? So that's the type of prediction that these kind of prediction markets would be gambling on, actual predictions about things in the world. And the idea then is that to be the best performer on these markets, you're going to go and do a bunch of research, and the people that are best at doing the research are going to perform best on the prediction markets. And so by being a good scientist and an innovative scientist and so on, you are going to be the one that gets the most resources. So that's kind of the idea.
and who proposes the claims for?
Well, that's a big question, obviously, right? And it's going to really depend on, yeah, there's a big question there.
No, it's interesting. Sorry.
And was your question also a follow-up, and Daniel's too, I
It's a
think?
comment, yeah.
Okay, yeah, let's do both.
Yeah, related to that, my understanding for success in such a market would be that only private information gets an advantage. And I know you raised that as a limitation that prevents communication, but how could you possibly overcome that? Where would any kind of publication, even formal publication, still feature?
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's like, you know, once the market closes, then you can write like, you know, as a particularly successful market trader, you can go out and like, you know, get even more money by writing a book about it. You know, maybe teams form, right? So we collaborate together to win on the market. And so there's not publication, but there's communication within competing teams, or something like that. But like, this would have clear implications and problems for the publication record of science and communication within science, like inescapable.
Yeah, it's very similar to these Netflix prizes. Do you know this? Where
Right,
teams
trying to predict the, yeah.
So Netflix wants the team to predict what people will enjoy or something, and whoever makes the best prediction gets €1 million. And then at the end, you have the same thing, that several teams teamed up to win from who was then the number one. And that's interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so I think one final question.
Yeah, I just wanted to say about cable that whether you're not expecting the same results as in cable, so people just, they have a lot of resources, they win, they use the prestige, not even the money, because they mostly fight for the prestige, and they then go back to private sector. Because in cable they solve programming issue, let's say algorithms and so on. And it's a public competition who does the best algorithm to solve the problem. And when they solve, they get some money, but then they use it as a tool to find better jobs, not to solve more problems.
Right. Yeah. So that's like another way you like sort of leverage market success into success in other areas. Yeah.
All right. Let's close this session here and thank Mike again.